There's a tendency for many progressives to dismiss or demonize landlords, calling them useless, parasitic, blaming them for our heightened cost of living, that they profit from housing insecurity, which is so globally pervasive. But while there is a lot of truth there, this is ultimately an amateur and infantile perspective, one which too many political parties and organizations still operate around. It leads to a reductive attitude that we can just fix our housing problems through regulating the market, seizing property, taxing the billionaires through the right policy settings. This way of thinking is reminiscent of an old, outdated way of thinking about landlords and housing and their role in the economy, and in part drives much of the nostalgia that rots the political left. And so without properly understanding the role of landlords and housing in the modern capitalist economy, we can't possibly hope to build a better future.
What actually is a landlord though? It sounds a bit silly, but in addressing these misconceptions, we have to understand the role of landlords as a social class in our society, both historically and currently. Many simply just lump in landlords into being profit-hungry capitalists or leftovers of feudalism, both of which are incorrect. Landlords predate capitalism, as in the feudal period, they were the dominant social class. Production and distribution revolved around the economic relationship between rentier and renter, between landlord and tenant. Landlords would let tenants use their land, and in exchange, the landlord would charge some kind of payment or extract rent. As capitalism emerged, however, feudal landlords became divorced from production and distribution. Under capitalism, capitalists would pay a laborer to produce goods and services, commodities, which would be then sold for a profit. This is called commodity production, and its generalization is what's considered the beginning of capitalism.
Of course, landlords didn't just disappear. Many landlords became capitalists, or capitalists became landlords, or capitalists would pay rent to a landlord in exchange for using their land for commercial purposes.
Therefore, while landlords charging rent remained present within capitalism, rent extraction went from being the center of social relations to being something skimmed off the top of profits made by capitalists or wages paid to workers, but nonetheless existing around commodity production.
This is something that Big Carl talks about in his third volume of Capital, highly recommend, saying that the circumstance that 1, rent is limited to the excess above the average profit, and that 2, the landlord is reduced from the manager and master of the process of production and of the entire process of social life to the position of mere lessor of land, usurer in land, and mere collector of rent is a specific historical result of the capitalist mode of production. The income of the landlord may be called rent, even under other forms of society, but it differs essentially from rent as it appears in this mode of production. Now you may think this is boring, this is super basic theory stuff, who cares? Unfortunately, many thousands of dollars and book tours have been made of misunderstanding social relations in different societies.
In Marx's time, the vast majority of people in society were propertyless, funding most of their subsistence through wages from work. So the times Marx discussed real estate markets and their relation to the economy, it was in the context of a much more stratified capitalism, where land was entirely controlled by a small and concentrated number of capitalists and landlords. Through their monopoly held over land, the ruling classes were able to benefit from the most shameless exploitation of poverty through the monstrous power wielded by landlords, and when united hand in hand with industrial capital, enabled it to be used against laborers engaged in their wage struggle as a means of practically expelling them from the earth as a dwelling place. So, in other words, the ruling classes used the threat of homelessness as a tool of disciplining workers who wanted higher wages and better conditions.
While incredibly insightful for 19th century Western Europe, the findings of Marx's analysis isn't replicable elsewhere, and in fact he says as much. Despite this, the political left by and large has extrapolated this view of landlordism and housing throughout time, history and space. Here in current day Australia, 68% of the population own their own home as private property, they're landowners. The majority of income quintiles bar the very lowest, are all majority landowners. About 20% of households, or 2.2 million people, are landlords with one or more investment property on top of their residential property. There's more property investors in this country than unemployed people, and only about 600,000 more people on minimum wage than there are property investors. Rather than this tightly knit cabal of uber rich elites owning all the property, Australia's 2.2 million property investors own all of 3.2 million investment properties in this country, and they are vastly more geographically sparse. 70% of landlords own one investment property, and about 50% of all investment properties are owned by those landlords with one investment property. So while it is absolutely true that the top 1% of landlords disproportionately own a lot of property, it's also true that Australian landlordism is incredibly decentralized and sparse. In fact, while general managers and executives are common landlord professions, a landlord is just as likely to be a school teacher or a nurse or an accountant. Therefore, rather than money capital being reserved for a select group of uber-rich elites, the vast majority of what's traditionally considered the working class has, to varying degrees, gone into copious amounts of debt to buy their home as an asset, as private property, and the upper strata of them rent out an investment property. As such, the role of housing and landlords in our economy today is just completely different to what it was in 19th century Western Europe. To sound like an intellectual fuckwit, class back then was homogenous, whereas today it's heterogeneous.
During Marx's time, the capitalist needed the landlord, or needed to become the landlord, in order to provide housing to reproduce their workforce, or they needed workers to have a home to go to, rest, and be ready for the next day of work. As mentioned, this allowed housing to be a disciplinary tool against rebellious workers, as, if you went on strike, the capitalist or the landlord or both could just kick you out of your home and you would be homeless.
Today, however, capitalist economies have undergone a process of financialisation, departing from the previous Fordist industrial capitalism, and so the role of landlords has changed. Today, real estate is both the site of reproduction and the primary engine of capital accumulation in the 21st century, characterized not by stratified, clear-cut, geographically specific class relations, but by a sparse and sprawling network of financial arrangements. The housing finance cycle implies the financial sector is able to generate and monetize, in the form of interest on mortgage debt, a significant proportion of land rents via credit creation. Here's how that works. By the 1980s, about 70% of Australians owned their own private property. Through the 1980s, the financial sector was deregulated, which essentially made it easier for banks to extend out loans and for people to go into more and more debt. This obviously increased the effective demand of borrowers, or in other words, increased their ability to spend in the economy. Here, a natural experiment was incidentally run, as residential and commercial loans both grew concurrently at about the same rates. However, under deregulated financial systems, banks tend to favor collateralized mortgage lending over personal loans and loans to businesses, because land tends to appreciate and is virtually impossible to hide. Following widespread banking system distress in the early 90s, most lenders concentrated their portfolios on low-risk mortgage lending. The total share of business loans on banks' balance sheets fell by 15 percentage points to 48% between 1991 and 1995, while the share of mortgages increased by 16 percentage points to 46%. This trend has continued through to the 21st century. Today, 60% of bank lending goes into residential mortgages. 40% of those loans go towards landlords, and it is the growth in this lending, and therefore the growth in house prices, which has been driven by landlords in the past few years. Now, there's a lot more to talk about with regards to the property industry, whether it be the fictitious capital of mortgage-backed securities, superfluous commodity exchange in the form of, I hate to say it, real estate agents providing socially necessary labor to landlords, but fundamentally what has developed in the transition to a financialized economy, money capital, finance, has in real terms subsumed or taken over the site of social reproduction, in this case the provision of housing, and embedded it in what makes the capitalist economy move, that being the creation of money. Housing was once produced and exchanged for reproducing the labor force, but through financialisation, it has now become a necessary bedrock to the function and survival of the capitalist mode of production. The existence and performance of our financial institutions, and therefore our economy, is predicated upon the performance of the real estate market, the value of real estate, the price of housing, growing in perpetuity and substantially. And this didn't happen because of a small clique of evil billionaires or conglomerates conniving with politicians or whatever, but through the mass participation of the working class through homeownership and its upper strata through property investment. And the figures are astonishing. I really can't overstate how much of a behemoth residential property is in the modern economy. Today, the total value tied up in housing is $12.3 trillion, or over 400% of GDP. Household debt is 112% of GDP. 90% of the financial system is made up by the big four banks, and they are also the biggest shares on the Australian Stock Exchange. And these banks, remember, are predominantly exposed in real estate markets. Landlordism and rent extraction isn't just the site of social reproduction subordinate to commodity production anymore. It has become necessary to motivate money capital to lend out into the economy, to create money, to get the economy moving and growing. The rent of tenants is extracted by a highly dispersed landlord class who then service their mortgage, which facilitates the further circulation of housing commodities and movement of money capital. In fact, such movements and investments are so fictitious at this point, as Marx would say, that about half of landlords report making a net loss. As such, landlords increasingly rely on selling off their property in order to pay off their mortgage. As such, landlords are increasingly relying on substantial house price growth and then selling off their investment property to pay back their mortgage. 50% of landlords sell their investment property within the first 2 years of purchasing it. Inevitably, this increases the speed at which housing commodities are circulating on the market and therefore dramatically increases house prices. Indeed, as housing becomes inevitably more expensive for potential or current homeowners, banks become increasingly reliant on landlords to borrow money and invest in property. Therefore, because the modern capitalist economy is reliant on finance, itself exposed in real estate markets driven more and more by the debt-fueled consumption of landlords, underpinned by fictitious money capital, landlords have become necessary not only to the performance, but the function of the Australian economy.
This is why the left populists, the ones who demonize an abstract, nebulous neoliberalism, actually need landlords. For their program of reform to work, they require a stable and growing economy to govern over. The political hero of many, Gough Whitlam, explains it very clearly. The program of social reform embarked on by the Whitlam government cannot be achieved without a strong and growing private sector. Nothing could be further from the truth than that we are anti-business or hostile to business.
Yet the ambitions of the left, if taken to their logical conclusions, would disenfranchise both the classes which benefit from the various problems we complain about and the working class that they crusade on behalf of. This working class identity, a homogenous, propertyless prole as a formative agent of social change, no longer exists, at least in the traditional sense. Yet much of the political left still fights on behalf of this ghost. Unfortunately, because many still operate under the framework of 20th century politics, and indeed many are nostalgic for 20th century social democracy, our current social and economic conditions are crudely analysed. And so whether or not the left populists or dissidents want to admit it or not, their politics and action requires the existence of landlordism. We live in such a different time to people like Marx, Lenin, Whitlam, but our current conditions remain so insufficiently analysed. While obviously not without its own problems, the best piece of literature on this topic is Dr. Martin Duck's PhD thesis. If you don't read it, you're not going to properly understand Australian politics, the Australian economy in the modern day, but if you don't want to, listen to his concluding remarks here. Both the Australian Greens and Cameron Murray have put forward proposals for a public builder to supply homes into owner occupation at near cost. If implemented, these proposals would go a long way toward increasing the supply of homes with or against the building cycle. Yet they would in many ways reproduce the selling of public housing from the mid-1950s and its implicit tenure bias logics, of which this thesis has been so critical. The paradigm these self-proclaimed dissidents have constructed cannot escape the fact that financialized housing has become the contact point between the governmentalized state and asset-orientated households, crucial to financial stability and economic growth, and a key transmission mechanism of monetary and fiscal policy. Owner-occupied and investment housing has become an institution too big to fail or bail out in the event of financial and economic crises. Housing in Australia has therefore become subject to a perpetual drip-feed bailout with exclusionary effects.